Episode 40, titled Dependency and Supply Chain Findings, we're going to focus on why third-party components create real risk even when your custom code is clean. Pen Test Plus scenarios increasingly reflect modern reality. Applications are assembled from libraries, packages, frameworks, and hosted services, and vulnerabilities can enter through those building blocks without a developer ever writing a bad line of code. This changes how you think about risk, because the weakness might not be in your logic. It might be in what you rely on, how you configure it, and where it sits in your trust boundary. The exam is not asking you to become a software composition analyst, but it is asking you to reason about dependency findings responsibly, especially around reachability, impact, and prioritization. The danger is treating every dependency alert as a crisis, which creates noise and undermines credibility, or treating them all as irrelevant, which creates blind spots. The goal here is to give you a disciplined way to confirm what is present, understand how it is used, and prioritize remediation that fits. By the end, you should be able to read a dependency finding and decide what it means in context. Dependencies are external building blocks, and they include not only libraries and packages, but also services and components that your application relies on to function. A library might provide parsing, authentication helpers, or data handling logic, while a package might bundle larger functionality, and a hosted service might provide identity, storage, messaging, or analytics capabilities. The supply chain risk idea is that every building block introduces an inherited trust relationship because you are trusting that component to behave safely and to be maintained. On the exam, dependency language often appears as third-party component, library, framework, or service, and the test is whether you understand that risk can exist even when your own code follows best practices. Dependencies also expand the attack surface because they increase the number of places where a weakness might exist. When you recognize dependencies as inherited code and inherited trust, you can explain why they matter without exaggeration. This framing also sets up the next step, understanding version risk and usage context. Vulnerable versions appear for predictable reasons, and the exam expects you to connect those reasons to realistic remediation decisions. Outdated components persist because patching and updating can be disruptive, because teams may not have visibility into what is running, or because change control slows the update cycle. Abandoned projects create risk because vulnerabilities may never be fixed upstream, leaving the organization to replace, isolate, or accept risk with compensating controls. Weak defaults create risk because a component can be present and working while still being configured in an unsafe way, especially if developers assumed the defaults were secure. Version drift can also happen when different environments run different versions, causing a finding to be true in one place and not another, which affects confidence and reporting language. Pen Test Plus questions often include a dependency alert and ask what to do next, and the right answer typically involves confirming version and usage rather than acting as if the alert is automatically exploitable. When you understand why vulnerable versions persist, you can propose realistic fixes.
Transitive dependencies are an important concept because they represent risks inherited from components you did not choose directly. A direct dependency is the one you intentionally include, but that direct dependency often includes other libraries, and those included libraries can carry their own vulnerabilities. This matters because teams can be surprised by a vulnerability in a component they never heard of, yet that component is still part of their runtime environment and can still influence behavior and exposure. The exam expects you to understand that supply chain risk can be several layers deep, meaning visibility must extend beyond the top-level list.
Transitive risk also complicates remediation because fixing the vulnerable component
may require updating or replacing the parent dependency that pulls it in. It can also create timing challenges because upstream updates may be needed before a clean fix is available. When you can explain transitive dependencies plainly, you can reason about why a finding exists and why remediation sometimes requires dependency upgrades rather than a local patch. Common impacts from vulnerable dependencies tend to fall into a few familiar categories, and you should be able to connect them to context without overclaiming. Some vulnerable components can enable remote execution behaviors, which is high severity because it can lead to full compromise if reachable and usable in the app's context. Others can enable data exposure by weakening input handling, serialization, authentication flows, or access control behavior, leading to confidentiality loss or integrity issues. Some vulnerabilities can enable privilege escalation paths, especially when dependencies are used in privileged services, administrative tools, or identity-related workflows. The exam often tests whether you distinguish potential impact from actual impact, because impact depends on how the component is used and whether the vulnerable functionality is reachable through exposed paths. You should treat impact statements as conditional, unless the scenario states reachability and usage clearly. When you keep that discipline, you avoid turning a component alert into a guaranteed breach narrative. Prioritization queues are what turn a long list of dependency alerts into a manageable action plan, and the exam expects you to prioritize using exposure, reachability, exploit maturity, and business criticality. Exposure is about whether the application surface that uses the component is reachable from relevant attackers, such as being internet-facing or accessible to many internal users. Reachability is about whether the vulnerable functionality is actually used and can be invoked through realistic paths, because a vulnerable library in a codebase is less urgent if it is not exercised in the deployed workflow. Exploit maturity is about how likely it is that the vulnerability can be abused easily in practice, which can influence likelihood, especially when exploit patterns are well known. Business criticality is about what the application does and what data it handles, because a moderate vulnerability in a mission-critical system may deserve higher priority than a severe vulnerability in a low-value isolated tool. Pentest Plus often rewards candidates who apply these cues rather than simply sorting by severity labels. When you can articulate prioritization cues clearly, your remediation recommendations become more realistic. Validation thinking in this area means confirming presence and usage without triggering harmful behavior, because dependency findings often begin as inventory signals rather than demonstrated exposure. Confirming presence means verifying that the vulnerable component version exists in the deployed environment, not just in a build file or a report, because environments can differ. Confirming usage means determining whether the application actually invokes the vulnerable code path, which can often be done through safe observation of configuration and functional flow, rather than by attempting a harmful proof. The exam expects you to avoid exploit-first thinking here, because dependency vulnerabilities can be high risk, and careless proof attempts can cause outages or unintended data exposure. A safe approach is to gather enough evidence to justify the finding and the priority, while minimizing disruption and data handling risk. This is also where confidence language matters, because you may be able to confirm presence, but not confirm reachable usage under constraints. When you validate responsibly, you make the finding both credible and safe. Now, imagine a scenario where a vulnerable library exists, but impact is unclear, because this is a classic exam setup. You receive an alert that a specific component version is known to be risky, but the prompt does not state whether the application uses the vulnerable feature or whether the exposed surface exercises that code path. The wrong move is to assume impact and declare urgent compromise, because that overclaims and can misdirect remediation. The professional move is to confirm that the component is present in the deployed environment
and then determine where it is used in the application's workflows, focusing on whether the usage sits behind authentication, whether it processes untrusted input, and whether it runs with high privilege. You then classify the finding with appropriate confidence, such as confirming presence but treating impact as likely or uncertain depending on evidence. Based on that, you prioritize next validation steps that clarify reachability without causing harm. This scenario tests whether you can be careful and still be decisive, because cautious does not mean passive, it means evidence-driven. Remediation options should be framed as update, replace, isolate, or apply compensating controls, because different dependency situations require different strategies. Updating is the cleanest path when a safe version exists and the application can be upgraded without breaking functionality, though it still requires testing and change control. Replacing is necessary when the project is abandoned or the update path is unrealistic, meaning you choose a different component or redesign the dependency away. Isolating reduces risk by limiting where the vulnerable component can be reached, such as restricting exposure, segmenting access, or placing additional controls around the affected function. Compensating controls reduce likelihood or impact when immediate updates are not possible, such as tightening authentication, adding monitoring, limiting input paths, or adding protective gateways while planning the longer-term fix. The exam often rewards layered remediation because it reflects real-world constraints, where immediate patching is not always feasible. A strong recommendation pairs urgent risk reduction with durable correction. When you can choose among these options based on constraints, your recommendations fit. Reporting language for dependency findings should state what is confirmed, how the dependency is used, and what the likely impact is in this environment, keeping cause and consequence separate. Confirmed statements should include the fact of the dependency's presence and version in the relevant environment, because that is the foundation of the claim. Usage statements should describe where and how the component is invoked, such as which application function relies on it and what trust boundaries it sits behind, without publishing sensitive internal details unnecessarily. Likely impact statements should be conditional and context-aware, connecting exposure and reachability cues to potential consequences like data exposure or privilege pathways. The report should avoid turning inventory alerts into certainty, and it should avoid copying sensitive artifacts or access details that could enable abuse. Pen Test Plus questions often test reporting maturity by offering language that overstates impact versus language that is precise and defensible. When you report with careful confidence, stakeholders trust your prioritization and act faster. A common pitfall is assuming every dependency alert is exploitable immediately, which leads to wasted effort and credibility loss. Some alerts refer to conditions that are present but unreachable, some refer to components that are not actually deployed, and some refer to vulnerabilities that require specific usage patterns that the app does not exhibit. Another pitfall is ignoring transitive dependencies because you only look at top-level components, which creates blind spots that attackers do not respect. There is also the pitfall of focusing only on severity scores without considering reachability and business criticality, which can cause misprioritization. A professional approach treats dependency alerts as triage signals that require context and validation, not as automatic emergencies. At the same time, you avoid dismissiveness by prioritizing high exposure, high privilege usage first. When you avoid these pitfalls, your findings remain both accurate and actionable. Quick wins come from focusing on internet-facing and high-privilege dependency usage first because those conditions raise likelihood and blast radius. Internet-facing usage increases the chance that an attacker can reach the vulnerable path, which makes even moderate vulnerabilities more urgent. High-privilege usage increases the potential consequence because a vulnerability exploited in a privileged service can affect many systems or sensitive data stores. Quick wins also include reducing exposure while updates are planned, such as restricting access to the affected function, tightening authentication, or improving monitoring to detect attempted abuse. These actions are often feasible within operational constraints and can reduce risk quickly even when full patching takes time. Pentest Plus tends to reward these practical, layered choices because they show you understand risk management under constraints. Quick wins should still be documented clearly, including what they reduce and what they do not reduce, so stakeholders understand residual risk. When you prioritize quick wins effectively, you turn supply chain findings into immediate improvement. A memory anchor can keep your dependency reasoning disciplined, and a useful one is confirm, contextualize, prioritize, remediate, monitor. Confirm means verify presence and version in the deployed environment rather than trusting a list blindly. Contextualize means determine where the component is used, what trust boundaries apply, and what exposure exists, because impact depends on usage. Prioritize means order actions based on reachability, exploit maturity, and business criticality rather than severity labels alone. Remediate means choose a realistic path update. Update, replace, isolate, or compensating controls aligned with constraints and change management realities. Monitor means ensure detection and validation, confirming that fixes close exposure safely and that unusual behavior is visible during the remediation window. This anchor is short enough to run under exam pressure and maps directly to how supply chain questions are framed. If you can remember it, you can answer dependency scenarios with consistent logic. In this episode, the key supply chain reasoning is that third-party components can introduce serious risk through vulnerable versions and transitive dependencies, and that risk must be prioritized based on exposure, reachability, exploit maturity, and business criticality. Validate findings by confirming presence and usage without triggering harmful behavior, and avoid the pitfall of treating every alert as immediately exploitable. Recommend remediation that fits the situation, update when possible, replace when necessary, isolate when exposure needs reduction, and apply compensating controls when patching must wait while improving monitoring and documentation. It is confirmed that what is confirmed from what is inferred, and frames impact in context rather than as certainty. Now rank 3 example findings quickly in your head by considering which one is internet-facing, which one is tied to high privilege, and which one is least reachable, because that prioritization reflex is exactly what Pentest Plus is trying to measure. When you can do that calmly, dependency findings stop being noise and become structured risk decisions. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.